So policies are required to provide security, authentication, rate limiting, whitelisting, more things basically. But sometimes there are very specific policies that are required in terms of dealing with business validations and business logics. At that point of time, custom policies come into play basically. So here today we are going to see how we can set it up, basically prerequisites, setting it up, then the inbound custom policy, outbound custom policy, exception handling for the custom policy, and YAML configuration. That is the UI configuration where when you try to apply a policy and the options that you get while trying to apply the policy. So yeah. So talking about steps basically in deploying the in a successful deployment of a custom policy would be to develop the policy first, package it, then upload it as an asset to the exchange, and then consume it using API manager. Just a side note on this. Yeah, as we may all know basically that there is something known as a mule agent that will be working and looking at when the policy is applied, and it picks it up and applies the policy, right? But it would be recommended over here if you have very complex code in your custom policy to not just apply the policy, but the application that it is getting applied on should also get a chance to restart basically, and restart the application, and then basically look at the effects of the custom policy. So yeah, moving ahead, to basically create a custom policy, you will require an archetype, a profile inside your settings.xml in the M2 folder that we have, Maven settings basically. Also, along with that, you should be already having your credentials in it, and also optional would be the Nexus repository credentials. So there is something known as HTTP transform extension that we will be using in policy that is only available for enterprise Nexus, but that is optional. We can still use transform. We'll look at it down the line. So let's get into basically how we can create a custom policy. So the easiest way and the most you know I would say to use this basically command that's on the screen to create a custom policy using the archetype that you saw, and you we added which will be added in the settings.xml. So based on this command, I would like to show you like how this command works in a sense, and how the policy basically gets created, custom policy gets created in your local, and what all components are there inside the custom policy when it gets created basically. So yeah, let's so this would be the command uh, up top, and I'm going to use command prompt to basically create a custom policy. And here I have already added my org ID. I'm just going to change the policy name to something like demo policy.
Yeah, before we jump onto that, can you throw some light on why exactly do we need custom policies? Because if you go to guide manager, right, you will already see a lot of a list of um, predefined policies already there, right?
Yeah,
Now,
we do have a list of predefined policies basically, but those policies won't cover your business validations. Those policies. Let me just show the policies that. Uh,
Neil, I guess you somehow stopped sharing.
oh, okay. Is it visible now? Yeah, it should be.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. So we have policies that are basically provided by Mulesoft, and that can be used out of the box basically. And let me just go over them. So yeah, these would be the policies that will be provided to you out of the box, basically by Mulesoft. And as you see, there are many basically, and custom policies would actually come at the end every time, but you can filter them. So as we know, uh, all these pre-provided policies would deal with security, whitelisting, as you see, and also access rate limiting, basically, and other things. But uh, at some point of time, uh, if a client or a business requirement comes into play, saying if you have a certain set of headers, instead of passing those headers directly to the API, can you modify those headers and create a single new header and then pass it, basically, so that the API can directly use it. And these sort of business validations can be or business requirements can be uh, carried out in custom policy. Even modification of a payload, if you're getting certain payload, you can modify that payload, and then send it to the API or microservice, basically. So these are the capabilities that you can leverage, and this can help you with also you can use the existing policies that are there and then build over them, basically, as per your requirement, as per your needs as well. That also creates a custom policy, basically, if you if you have such sort of a requirement. So that would be that would be the policies that are provided by MuleSoft. So as we were looking at how we can create a custom policy using the archetype, uh, any questions about the pre-existing policies, or any other questions related to that?
You guys feel free to ask questions,
Yeah,
and you have, feel free to stop. I guess everybody has capability to speak right now. Yeah, and if you don't have this, drop a message.
Yeah, I have a question. So Mihir, would you be would you guys be sharing the slide deck as well, right?
Yeah,
uh,
Because
I'll do that.
if not, it would be, I mean, would it be possible for you to like paste those instructions or scripts that you're running there in the chat as well?
yeah, sure. I can paste the instructions that I'm running here in the chat as well as we go.
Thanks, thanks.
So yeah. Mm, actually, I'm just substituting the variable so you guys can add your details, basically, based on it. So
Yeah, so I have a question. So what is archetype and why we need this?
this will actually help you to create a pre-pack, like a base for your custom policy. Basically, you don't have to start it from scratch. This will help you to create get the artifact and basically start have some sort of a base, and then build over it, something like that, instead of manually writing the POM, manually writing the YAML file that is needed, manually creating all the folders and everything.
For custom policy, we can have use this also for custom connector.
The custom connector uses SDK sort of a thing, and it does not need it, basically. It can use XML SDK, and you can build your custom connector through that.
So we don't need to use archetype there also, is it?
No, you don't need to use archetype over there. I don't think you need to use any archetypes over there.
So
Custom connector.
basically, archetype is what? Like if we want to define it, what is archetype? It's a command or what it is like?
It will be a asset in a sense. Asset in a sense. base for you to build your custom policy on, but where will you get it from, right, basically? So instead of getting it from a GitHub repository or something, we have kept it as you see, can share the deck, and you can see the repository would be mulesoft.org, and inside the Nexus repository, it has been placed for public, basically public use. So you can get the base on which you will be building your custom policy directly from there using just a Maven command through Maven, basically.
Okay, so by default it will pick all the required artifacts from there, right?
Yes, yes,
Then we set
yes,
the artifacts. Okay,
yes. I will show you basically once I run this command. You will be able to see that.
thank you.
So I'm just pasting the command in chat so you guys can take a look at it. So let's run this and let's see the output for this one, right? Um, so yeah, now it will start asking you a few details like policy description. I'm just going to give demo. Then policy name, what you want to give. I'm just going to give custom mm, policy demo. And then it will basically show you the details that it's going to use to build it, basically. And when you say yes, it builds it. So these are very few logs you're seeing over here because I have previously built a policy. But once you start building it from scratch, basically for the very first time, you should be seeing all these files getting downloaded from Maven Arc plugin, Archetype plugin, right? So all these files are all these things are down, all the dependencies are being downloaded over here. And then once the project is created, you will end up with you should end up with something like demo policy, right? We just created it. The demo policy will have a source folder, MuleSoft artifact JSON. As we all know, it's always there in the Mule application, and you can use for multiple things, basically. Now, demo policy YAML is actually a configuration for the screen, basically, in a sense. When you try to apply the policy, you get a pop-up saying what all things you need, basically, so you can configure it over there for the custom policy, like a input field or something like that. uh, there are different types of those fields, and we will take a look at those as well later down the line. uh, and pom.xml that gets created, that has the build details and the repository that it's going to use. In source, you have source main mule, and then template.xml. Template.xml is the place where your actual custom policy code resides, and we do not change the name of this template .xml. If you policy won't get built if you change the name of this file, basically. That's a heads up sort of a thing. It has to be template.xml, and it needs to be preserved in that way. So let's load it up inside Anypoint Studio, and then we can see furthermore on it, basically. Oh,
Could you please do a favor? Like, can you please explain the commands that we run? What is the parameter we have to pass, and what these are?
so yeah, I can do that. Yeah. So
It will be really helpful for us, right, to understand properly.
So the parameters are being passed over here are basically the archetype, the repository, and the group ID that's there. These are all provided, these are all constant and these are all common, basically. So you don't need to worry about those. The version over here, you can change the policy that is going to get generated will have the version that you specify over here, and packaging will always be mule policy, basically. The only details when you're creating a custom policy from the very scratch, you need to worry about just the org ID that you will need to add and the name of the policy, what name you're trying to give to the policy. So that's the command basically. So let's.
Mihir, one question.
Mhm.
When you ran this command, you were prompted for policy name. So we need to ensure that the artifact ID, the policy name that you provided in the artifact ID, and the policy name that you provided here when it prompted you for should be same.
No, it's just the name. It's not the asset ID. If you're trying to, say, it's just the name basically that will come inside your pom.xml. We can let me load it up in any point, and we can take a look at the pom as well.
Okay.
So as you can see, let's go over the pom first, right? So the artifact that I provided was demo policy, right? And let's go over the command as well, side by side. So the command said demo policy. So that is the artifact ID that gets added over here. The name when you give while creating the policy gets added over here, basically. So these are two different things that you know that are there basically.
Okay.
Once,
Got it.
so basic basically when you get this created using the command, you will have the dependency, that will be the http policy transform extension. But as per my understanding, this is only for users that have access to enterprise nexus. Nexus, we can use transform instead of these. But and other things would be the build, the mule maven plugin and the mule deploy plugin with all the repository details. Now I'm going to change a few things before deploying this policy basically. Few things is the repository ID. uh, in your settings.xml, we have a server, right, basically with your credentials in it. So make sure the id that you are the id that you have given over there matches the id in the sense over here basically. So it has access to that particular repository. And when you give the org id, it helps you to create this url over here as well. It will basically put in the org id over here in the scaffolding, and it will use and it will create such a thing for you, in a sense, the link of the repository. So I'm going to change this repository id to demo basically. So once you do that, this is now set to basically deploy to account you want basically, based on based on the repo id that you have given, and it should match with the credentials basically, the server. But looking inside the template that this has created, the template would be just a inbound policy with a hello world in it. Just a in this is just an inbound policy with a hello world transform that gets added to it basically. Also you have this YAML file, this demo
Um,
policy YAML file. Yeah, go ahead
hey
please.
Mihir, sorry to cut.
Yep.
Could
Yeah.
you please go back to that pom.xml and the last step you did? Can you come again on this part?
Yeah, this is where I basically substitute the server a server id. In
Okay.
settings.xml, you should have your credentials added, right? And you
Mm-hmm,
should have an id associated to it,
mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So,
We
Mihir,
use this.
the server means it's anyone platform credentials.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Okay.
And you add it over here, so those anypoint credentials get used to basically deploy, add the policy to the exchange, basically
Got
deploy
it.
the policy to the exchange. Also, we as I was saying, this is a very basic and custom policy, basic policy scaffolding that you can use to basically build over and there are many other options that you can add in this basically. uh, just to go ahead, just to check whether this is correct or not, I am going to run ambient clean package on it. Just the second. The demo, uh, this cmd clean package. So this will help you to determine if there are any not logical but dependency issues that you might face. But just a I just do it as a precautionary sort of a step. But but to deploy your policy, you will use mv and deploy. So this will help you to deploy. This will basically get your policy deployed to the exchange, for the credentials that you have given basically. um, so letting it deploy, I'm just gonna leave it and let it deploy. uh, so the so as per understanding, there are two sets of policies basically: an inbound policy, inbound custom policy that you can use, and an outbound policy that you can use. So let's start looking at the inbound policy. So as the basic scaffolding that you get is a inbound policy. And once it is applied as default, like as it is to an application, and what impact it will have basically. So if you consider a inbound policy, a single policy, a policy A, and a flow basically with a listener and a flow one, the execution of the of the event would be in such a manner: when the request comes, it will basically execute the A1 block, then go to execute next basically, tells that you need to go ahead now, means to the next policy, or to the microservice which it is applied to basically. If there is a next policy, it will go to the next policy that is applied in order basically.
So, Meher, sorry to interrupt you. Could
Yeah.
you please explain what is inbound custom policy and an outbound, and what is the difference, and when to use that?
Yes, yes. So inbound custom policy is used when you have a request coming in basically from coming into your microservice, and you have to modify the request first, or handle the request and then pass it to the microservice. And also when the microservice tends to send a response back to the client, you can alter that response as well. At that point of time, you use an inbound custom policy. When it is a request coming to the when you need to modify a request coming to the coming to your microservice and going out of your microservice, then at that point of time, you have an inbound custom policy being used. Now an outbound custom policy is used
S-
when, yeah.
Meher, sorry. When you say modify, what does it mean actually? Like,
Modify means you can write a piece of code over there basically to modify or to alter the headers, the payload that are coming in, or even have a logic saying, uh, if this header is not present, I'm not going to execute next, something like that. A choice router, something like that.
no,
So
but this can
yeah.
be handled in Mulesoft Flow also, right? These are the basic logics we have. So why do we need go with the custom policies and all?
So custom policy is like, it can be before even hitting your microservice, right? You have
Mm-hmm.
some set of business validations that you don't need to do it in your microservice. Before even the request hits the microservice, you need to authenticate the user based on the headers that are coming in, and those are all custom headers and business related headers basically. So
You
Mm-hmm.
don't
even
have to transform, right?
you don't have to transform, but you can transform. I have worked on a policy that basically transforms the header and then sends it to the downstream API or the microservice. or even adds additional headers, additional headers to it, saying this is the policy version that uh, um, is being used, and something like that. Those headers are also can be uh, not used but logged inside the application, because at the end of the day, MuleSoft policy does not have its own logging. You rely on the MuleSoft application to uh, 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 log it, basically. Like, you will use the same resources. You can use logging inside this, but it gets logged based on the resources that are used by the application. um,
So
Just to add to what Nand's question was, I mean, because Nand had a point there. The moment we talk about transformation, that's when, I mean, any processing that we talk about, those are things probably which should, I mean, policies probably are not meant for that. I think the flows take care of
so
that. But
yeah.
yeah, I mean, any validations or anything that needs to be performed before it hits our API or
Yeah,
microservices as well.
majorly business validations. And
Yeah.
business validations, I'm saying transform in terms of adding a new header, or adding a new header and then passing it to the downstream API, or removing certain headers and then passing it to the downstream API, or altering the payload itself and then passing it to the downstream API. Based on the validation, there can be certain operations that can be performed, and then you can pass it to the downstream API, basically, or the API that you are applied the policy on. And I completely understand that we should not be having any sort of transformations, in the sense transformations or mappings inside policy, and we don't have such a thing inside policy. But based on the business validations, there might be conditions saying, if these two headers match, basically, then execute the next downstream operation, like either let it go to the next policy, or directly towards the microservice it is applied on, something like that.
Yeah, so guys, don't get confused where it says that we have some level of capability where we can play around with some sort of data, but it doesn't really provide you all the capabilities of what transformations can be done using these SQLs, right? That is part of the use of application itself. But here we have some level of coding which we can do and play around with the headers, maybe payload organization or validation of headers, payloads, or whatever you want. But this is not exactly the transformation part.
So, what I understand is like before hitting our actual API, this is some sort of validation we are doing, right? So before hitting it or before entering into our API, so it's a shield, right? Like policy is a shield. Like if somebody is sending the invalid stuff to us, so we are upfront validating it and send them back. Like this is not the valid request you
Right.
have
So
sent. Yeah,
policies, yes. If you talk about policies, policies are applied at the gateway level itself, right?
right.
That is the entry point of the. You didn't actually hit the service yet, right?
Right.
It was between the and the actual code right now. You are at the
Mhm.
gateway level itself, where you have that window of validating and doing some business to do that, right?
Yep. And then again, it's all depends upon the requirements. Might be the custom is it's for specific users or specific scenarios. And we have to think it is really we have to use for the common purpose. If it is very beneficial. Otherwise, we have to come with the next approach. Like, do we need to handle in our application itself, or we have to put this custom policies because it will then again having some sort of efforts involved, right?
That is true. That is true. So, lot of there are a lot of use cases, especially when the security is concerned. And I have seen a lot of use cases. One of my clients where we had the requirement where we wanted to differentiate the users because they don't client enforcement policy. They use their own custom policy to differentiate the users and
Mhm.
access to the ask for the IDs which are provided, right, to the
Mhm.
to the segregated users. So I think business validations and this solve the security whatever normal policies can't do. when then we recite to this custom policies.
Perfect, perfect. I got an idea. Yeah. Thank you.
So
So,
yeah, talking about inbound custom policy and the event flow that it caters. Once a request is being made to a application with an inbound policy attached to it, basically, what will happen is there is a first section where the request comes in and hits the A1 block inside the inbound custom policy, and then the HTTP policy execute next would basically prompt it to either go to the next policy or either go to the microservice it is directly applied on. If there is an existing policy below it, it will go to the existing policy below it, and it depends upon the policy order, and it can be set, the policy order can be sent in API manager. So once it goes to the flow, once the flow processes it and tries to send back a response, it will go through the A2 block. Basically the A2 block will have will say I mean if you're trying to give user details, suppose, right, and you need to mask certain values inside those user details for some reason, basically, right, you can you can carry out the masking over here, and then you can, in the A2 block, you can check whether any values are unmasked or something like that, and then basically the request the response is returned to the client. So the simple step would be the client call comes in, goes to the A1 block or any other blocks that follow. When it hits HTTP policy execute next, it will go to the underlying policy or the application it is applied on, depending upon if there is a policy in between or not. And then once the application is done processing the message, it will return it will go through the A2 block and then be returned to the consumer as a response. So this is how an inbound policy works. A very simple flow for an inbound policy. And we can have two policies in it, two inbound policies, something like this: policy A, policy B, and then the application. At this point of time, what will happen is it will execute the first block, the block above execute next, always all the blocks above execute next, and then it will go to the underlying policy again, execute the blocks that lie above execute next, and then proceed towards the flow. And once the flow is you know uh, done with the response will basically go to the uh, go to the B2 block. That would be the last policy that was applied before the request went into the request was processed by the flow, and then to the topmost policy in order, and then the then the response is basically sent out to the client that is trying to access this particular flow. So this is how you can have multiple inbound policies, one on top of other, basically, and they can work in a sequential order. uh, this We can observe this behavior. I have a dummy application, and let me apply a simple custom policy to it. Simple inbound custom policy. Yeah, I'm going to apply it for all methods. Let's go to the runtime manager to see if the policy is applied properly or not. as you see, the very last message, the simple custom inbound policy is applied, right? So let's see the effect of this on the flow. And after this, I will remove the policy, and then we can see the effects as well. So I'm hitting this request, a get request with client ID and secret. So I have gotten a response. So once the request goes in, you can see the logs. The request, this is the log that is placed inside the policy. So as you see, request reached policy, then the request was passed. Basically, request reached policy means it has reached the A1 block over here, and then due to execute next, it has been passed on to the API. So request has reached the microservice. These are the headers that are being logged inside, what all headers have been received. And there is no payload because it's a get request. And then uh, leaving this as this would be a outbound call. There is an outbound call being made inside the get request to fetch the data, and this is the log for it. But leaving this aside, when the request exits the microservice, we again go back to the response reached policy again. So this would be the A2 block, which which is logging it, basically saying the response has reached the policy, and then it has basically satisfied the request, the client request. So this simple yeah, go ahead please.
So, Mahesh, so the question is like the policy will wait for the response from the microservice, is it?
Yes, policy waits. Yes, and it is a chain of. I will show you the event flow basically that happens underlying how the message flow actually happens inside in when an inbound policy is applied, right? So let's go over it as we are here, right? So if you have such a code, right, inside your policy, you have something like HTTP. This is always the root elements basically, and then you have the HTTP source for inbound policy, and then you have HTTP process execute next. When the request comes, as there is nothing, it directly passes it to the flow, right? And inside the flow, uh, it would this message would actually log what payload it has basically, right? And the payload that it would have is 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 actually empty in the sense, but once it's returned, and once the request is being received by the client, as you're setting the payload inside the policy, the client would actually receive the payload saying policy message. So this is how the mule message propagation works. Policy waits when there is execute next. Policy waits for the underlying flow, or maybe other policies, means it would be a nested sort of a thing, but it would wait for the underlying application to process, and then basically the block after execute next gets processed.
Here, like, is if so, flow means it's another mule application, right? Actual mule
Yes,
application.
yes, actual mule application, yes.
Then how? Yeah, and how we gonna upload this policy to the API manager?
So uploading to the policy in the sense applying the policy to the API manager.
In the API manager, you saw one custom policy that. So how did we get that?
uh, just by merely deploying it. We did do MVN deploy, right? When we did MVN deploy, we should have, like, we got a custom policy in the API manager. One second, right? I will show. We deployed a demo policy, right? So now the API if I try to apply that policy should also be present. But uh, this policies.
Okay, got it. So it's there. If you execute, it will create a policy in API manager.
Yeah, I
No, it
think
won't. It won't create a policy in API manager. It would create it would get deployed to Exchange as an asset, and then the asset can be used through API manager. In a sense, the asset is a type of mule policy. So hence, API manager detects it, and API manager can use it basically, because it has been uploaded to the Exchange.
Okay.
Mihir, can you also show it in Exchange? What's the type of this
Yes.
application appearing in?
Yes.
So Meher, it will be good help like if you explain the step by like when you deploy through the Maven stuff and then it is deployed on Exchange and how you embed this policy in the API manager. That will be helpful for everybody.
Yes. Yes. So as you deploy this policy, we just use ambient deploy command, and as you see, this was successful, right? Once this command runs, sorry, yeah.
Okay, so
So
since we
so
have
once,
provided the org ID, that's why it gets into the Exchange,
yes, Exchange of that org,
right?
and once it gets to the Exchange, you will see the policy over here. Otherwise there won't be any policy. Let's do it. I mean, I can delete this policy, right? I will just delete this policy. There's a custom demo policy. I'm just gonna delete it, and let me apply it. Let me just deploy it again, right?
Amit, one more thing, just open once a POM file and just quickly in a minute or so, like these are the things, required things to deploy on your clouds, right? As you mentioned earlier as well, right? So all
So
will be synced.
yeah, so the required things in the POM is basically just change the repository ID. I have changed changed the ID over here because in my settings file, I'm using this server basically, right?
Hmm.
Server contains your ID and the credentials basically that you're trying to use to basically get it deployed, right? The command that we use to basically build the custom policy, we already add the org id to it, so the org id automatically gets added to the pom once so the scaffolding is created basically for you using this command. The policy name also, the artifact id also gets created basically, because you have added it inside the command.
Perfect.
And if I deploy that, and if you check the Exchange out, you will see, eh, refresh, you will see that asset id also coming in, right? Custom policy, the asset id isn't this actually, to be honest. This is not the asset id of it. This is the name basically that is showing up. You can check the name over here. This is the name. The artifact id actually that is demo policy basically. This is the artifact id for this. And this version details, no, I'm not sure where to get the artifact id to pop up and show, but for connectors you can, but I'm not sure where I can find it. But yeah, I think I need to take a look at it, and to see where we can actually find the artifact id here. But in a sense, you don't once this gets deployed, uh, there is no more use for the artifact id, in the sense you're going to apply it directly from the API manager. And inside the API manager, as I have basically uploaded the policy now, any API instance, if you can go in any API instance and go inside policy, you should be able to see that policy in here basically, custom policy demo, right? And this would bring up the snapshot, this would bring up the policy version basically. And this is also a part of the command, as we saw. This is also a part of the command. And if you want to update the version, you will of course manually have to change this one, like a new version of this policy has come into play, then you need to change this version, and then a new version gets deployed. But and that would actually also reflect over here, and also in exchange, basically exchange and here basically, and then you can pick and choose which version you want, and then you can apply it.
So Maher, do we have any naming conventions for versioning and all? Like we have to follow this snapshots of stuff, or
Depends upon again depends upon what the organization uses, but if you're following mule standards, basically it the scaffolding comes with it, so you can keep on using it and increment it as you go.
we can also customize it, right? There is
Yes,
no
you can also
impact.
customize it. Yes, definitely, I can easily remove snapshot and have just 1.0.1, uh,
Oh,
0.0.
all right.
So those are the there are many customizable options that are here basically. um, so moving ahead, this is as we saw, this is the mule message propagation chain. But we also can have, when we have multiple inbound policies, right, we need to make sure that we understand when the application responds, it will always the response will always go to the last policy inside the order, and then to the topmost policy in the order, and then go out to the client. And when the request comes in, it would come to the topmost policy inside the order, and reach the flow through the very bottom policy, basically reach the mule application on which all the policies are applied, through the last policy basically. So this is the flow of the message that will happen. Top policy to the bottom, then the process, then the microservice, and then basically back again from the lowest to the top in the order. And
Maybe like,
mhm.
is there any way we can perform asynchronously? Because I guess this will impact performance as well if we wait for a response to log again, come get the policy again, go out of the that policy which we're applying. Is
So asynchronously, in the sense one policy then the other, it is not possible, because these are
it comes from A1 to next policy, and we apply, we push it that if it is successful, it goes request to the actual application. That's it.
yes, that's what is happening basically. It will go to A1, B1, and then to the flow that is F1. But what happens after F1 responds? You have to go to the B2 section, and then to the A2 section, to basically get the final response to the client.
Mahir, I think question is now we are doing some synchronous step A1, V1, F1, V2,
Yes,
and
yes,
Q2.
yes,
So,
yes.
like, just let's suppose we have a rate limiting policy. We are just validating whether the rate limiting is crossing or not. And then, if it is not crossing, it ultimately having the access of our actual API, and we are not waiting for the response. So, this is what I think Siddharth is asking. Like, in that case, we are waiting for the response, and then we'll send to the user back. So it will be like a performance issue. So why we have
So,
to.
so every policy that you try to apply, even rate limiting policy, it will follow follows something similar to this basically. Once the request comes, it validates whether the request is not. Only thing is, it won't have the A2 block.
Right.
It won't have the A2 and B2 block.
Correct.
This A2 and B2 block I'm showing over here because it is not necessary for a policy to have the A2 and B2 block. You might only want to validate the request that is coming in, and you can just have no validations or anything, and just send the request out to the client. You won't have a A2 and B2 block over there at that point of time. You will just have A1 block and B1 block, and then the microservice, and then the request goes black through the policy, but you won't
Mhm.
see it because there is no block that are getting executed basically.
Right. It's up to us. Like, do we want to use the
Yes.
policies to respond back, or we have to use our APIs to respond back to the user?
So the response is always going to go through the policy. The only thing is there a processing block or not? Based on that, it will execute. Otherwise, it will go to the topmost policy. Basically, it will hand over straight away. It's a very very economical or less costly task. I don't think there is any cost involved over here. If you're trying to say this particular diagram is basically to give you an idea that how a mule event will occur when both the blocks are present. But for optimization and for usage, you might not even need two inbound policies. You might only have one inbound policy and just have this A1 block and not even have the A2 block, because at that time you will just be responding with whatever your application is providing, right? Something like that. Because all those things, basically transformations and everything is happening is is in your application. Then you need to send just the payload back. This A2 block is it's a very rare case condition, the A2 and B2 block, where you require to basically again modify or change or add extra headers, right? Once you need to add extra response headers or something that the client requires, at that point of time the A2 and B2 block come into play.
Here, one question.
Yeah.
This policy handle is always like a blocking thread, irrespective if there is anything to be executed in A2 or B2 block. Even then, the flow will pass from this mule application, or this flow will go to the B2 handle and the A2 handle, irrespective if there is anything to be executed or not. Is this what you're saying?
Yes, yes, yes.
Is this the same which is followed even in the standard policy, or this is the concept only with the custom policy?
uh, See, standard policies and custom policies, standard policies are just out of the box that are made by Mulesoft. They are at the core of things are same, basically. So once you say that your processing is done and you need to send a response back, it's every time going to be the B2 block and A2 block. Now it depends if you have anything to process in the B2 block or A2 block, and it is
The base,
always a block. Yeah.
the base. I mean,
Yes.
even though standard same, the flow and everything, that's all the same. But I mean, those codes are not visible to us, so we can't say for sure. But the base always the same. Policies also.
So you are saying these are the best practices we have to follow for the policies, but yeah, we can customize as per our requirement, is it?
Definitely, you
Uh,
can.
yes, yes.
And
These are all the options. Basically, we are just exploring all the options that are available to you to basically create a custom policy. You may want to use it, or you may not want to use some of those options. That's up to what you are trying to implement and what business logic you are trying to deal with.
Okay.
Business validations, basically.
But there is no hard and fast rule. So
No,
we
there is
have
no.
the process, we have the practices we can use as per our requirement.
Yes.
Literally.
So I can show you a demo, in a sense, a dummy code, right? See, inside this, I have HTTP policy execute next, right? But I don't have anything at the top. You see, right? I don't have the A1 block, right? I don't have it. Means when the request comes, it will hit the policy, but it will just go to the underlying application, and then I have the other block present. Hence, it will set the payload and then send the response back to the requester or the client, basically. So this is a this is a this can show you basically that this is also possible. Like, a customization is possible. You don't necessarily need to have all the blocks, basically. You just need whatever you want, basically. But this is just like a placeholder for you. Whatever you need to add, you can add over here. Otherwise, you don't need to even add anything. it will just be a pass through. But yes, it will be a blocking process, and it will wait for the API to respond if there is a block underneath it. Not even if there is a block underneath, even if there is a block underneath it or not, it is going to wait for the underlying microservice to execute, and then basically pass the response ahead to the requesting application.
So
So
here one more thing. Do we have any
yeah.
template, or like we have to manually put all these blocks in and all? Or the template will generate it,
So
or
so the template, as I said, right now, as we are coming close to the inbound policy,
Mhm,
as you can see, it already has, if you see the entire block, right, this is an inbound policy, right?
mhm,
HTTP source, I don't have the A1 block over here, right? And I applied the simple inbound policy as well. It is similar to this one. Only part is I have extra logging added in it. I can show you that code as well. But as you see, there is no block over here. I have the execute command, and at the end of the operation, I'm going to set every request, whichever resource this policy gets applied to. The response is always going to be 201 hello world, and a new header is going to be added. And I can show you this happening. I just requested American the application the policy is applied on, right? And I got a hello world response for flights. As soon as I remove this policy, right? Second, just remove this policy. This is the custom simple inbound, or I'll just disable it. And I need to request it a couple times before it clears out. Okay. It takes some time to come into effect. Even if you disable it, it will take some time to come into effect. So it should be done by now. Yeah, see, now all the responses coming for flights. I'm getting the data for flights. But as I applied an inbound policy, and as I had a section in it to basically change the response to a 201, and also have the body as hello world, and also add a new header inside it, it will do that. I will apply the policy back again, and you can see the uh, change in the response manager. Where am I going in access manager? Policies, and I'll apply. I don't need to apply the policy. The policy is already applied. I'll just enable it. Right. Again, it would take some time to come into effect, but we can see it. Request it a couple of times more. To wait.
Meanwhile, can you share one instance where we can, such use case where we can use this A2 and B2 block? Means when the request is about to hit any application, the business validation, for that business validation, we have this A1 and B1 block, right? That makes sense that we are
Yes.
not going to the flow, and before hitting any API, we're just doing some pre-validations. But
Yes.
what is the use case of, because that transformation we can do at the flow level itself
Yes.
within the application, then why
Yeah.
we need this A2 and B2 block? Is there any real-time scenario?
Yes. It will. Once you need to add header while responding to the client, right? Extra additional headers basically while responding to the client. So how will you add inside the flow? How will you add extra additional headers, that response headers for the client? The best way to do it, and if they are common headers, the best way to do it is to add them inside the policy. Basically, having some sort of a header injection inside it, and this would be the response header injection. And this block is also being done. So this code here itself, this is after execute next, right? As you see, right, this is an A2 block, right, that I'm trying to show, right? An A2 block. Inside that A2 block, I know this is not, I'm just transforming the body, but you don't need to transform the body. And I know the flow is going to take care of, all the mappings and everything. But I'm also adding a header over here. And if the policy is applied by now, we can see the response is coming as hello world instead of the flights object that we were getting. Also, the response header has something as new header and hello world.
Okay.
this
That's
this can come into play based on business, again, business use case, where where you need to have a certain set of headers that need to be a part of your response, right? At that point of time, it will be and if it's for many applications, it would be illogical to basically add it in each and every application, keep on adding the same logic inside each and every application for a response, right? So instead you can have a policy that has the logic, and then apply the policy on top of those applications, and you can have those headers injected, right, at the time of basically response.
Mihir, one quick question.
Yeah.
So, is there a policy, is there a concept of chaining of policies? So, suppose if we have three, four distinct policies in the exchange as
Yes.
assets, right?
Yes.
So, custom policies. So, can we order it or orchestrate it being applied?
Yes. 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 We can. Yes.
Are you
So
going to go over that?
yes. Yes. I will show you that one.
Okay.
So let's go on to the other section basically first. I want to explain what is outbound policy, and then I will apply both those policies together, and then you can see the effect on them, if effect of both those policies, right?
Mere quick question. As you mentioned, we are waiting for the response from the inbound stuff, right? So let's suppose our application takes too much time to respond back. What will the impact on them?
Mm, uh, the response if it is a request timeout, the error basically would be passed on to the policy, and then the response would be sent out at the
So,
end of the
mhm.
day. This is a blocking process. If the process fails, then there is no process being carried out ahead. Basically, if F1 fails for some reason, the application goes down or runs into out of memory issue,
Mhm.
there is nothing that these will wait for, right? Because the application has itself gone down, right? Something like that. The policies would be only removed by themselves, basically.
No, what
So
then it will mislead the consumer, right? Then
uh,
what is
mm,
the errors and response coming back?
so if you are manipulating the errors inside the B2 and A2 block, then only it will mislead and confuse, or confuse the user. If there is nothing being applied, it will just propagate the errors outside. We have error handling coming up as well, and you can
Okay.
see how error handling has been done inside the can be done with the custom policies.
Okay. So in custom policy, do we have any timeout stuff? Like, do we have any
No,
connector, right? Okay.
no. It is
Okay.
it is a blocking process. It will wait for the underlying process to finish.
Makes sense. All
Yeah.
right.
So going ahead, uh, yeah. Now there are if you observed here, basically, here we just spoke about, in a sense, a request coming in and directly going to the flow. Inside the flow, the payload would be an empty, but while sending the response, the payload would be proxy message, right? Something like that. This is this is while sending out a response. But what happens when you actually need to modify something inside the policy and then hand it over to the flow, like adding header or changing something inside the payload? How can you do that? So at that point of time, the A1 block comes into play, basically. So if you straight away add something inside the A1 block, what do you think? What will be the message? What will be the payload logged over here? Anyone that wants to answer this? What do you think the payload? What will be the log over here for the payload? Basically, what will be the payload?
Policy message.
No, it won't be policy message, because what happens over here is whatever you set inside this A1 block, it's not propagated by itself. You can't propagate these values. To propagate these values, you need to set something like a propagate message transform true to basically propagate the values to the payload. If these are set to this particular flag is set to true, then only then only this logger will actually print policy message. If it is not, it will just have an empty thing saying empty payload. That's it.
And the default value is false only, right?
Default value is false. Yes,
Yes.
you will have to explicitly enable it to basically to basically pass the set payload or any other transformations that you have done over here to the underlying policy or the microservice that is applied on.
Like if we are sending a payload, then actual payload will be printed out, right?
If you are sending any payload without any, you're saying with any policy or without? I
Like
mean,
we
I'm
have a
not getting
policy, I have a policy, but we are not explicitly enabling it. But we, let's suppose we have a post request, right? So in post request, we are sending some sort of payload,
Yes,
right?
yes, that payload would go in. That payload would go in. But if
Okay.
you have done, if you want to do any sort of changes for the payload, if you have done any sort of changes to the payload on the policy level, those won't be propagated.
Okay.
Those won't be propagated, and that payload won't be set to basically propagate those changes. If you want those particular changes inside, to be available for the underlying policy or the application, basically microservice, you will have to explicitly mention this flag and set it to true. Then only whatever operations that you're carrying out above the execute next basically comes into play and gets forwarded. So this is how the mule chain works. Basically, the mule message propagation works for inbound policy or the HTTP policy, HTTP policy source block, basically. Now let's come to any questions, any more questions here? Okay, considering it as no, I will move ahead with what is an outbound policy. So outbound policy here means if your flow has any requester, right, that is sending out a request to some other microservice or some other application, at that point of time this outbound policy comes into play. So here when you receive a request to the microservice, this policy does not come into play because this is not an inbound policy, this is an outbound policy. It is completely skipped. It won't be even taken into it won't be taken into consideration. It would go to the it would go to the microservice. Actually it will come to the policy, but as there is no source block, it policy won't do anything. The request would be handed over to the microservice or the policy underlying. The operations would be carried out in the microservice underlying, and then responded in the same fashion. At that point of time the outbound policy won't come into play. But if your microservice is trying to communicate is has a requester that is requesting some other service, right, some other service, at that point of time this outbound policy comes into play. Considering you have received a request, considering you have received a request, the flow would be something like HTTP listener, then your F1 block, basically whatever block of code you have, then you have your HTTP requester, right? at the time of sending out a request, this policy would come into play. Before sending the request to um, the service provider, basically we will have the A1 block being executed. Then the request would reach the service that we want to consume. Once you get the response from from that service, it will come to the A2 block, and that means you have gotten the response inside the application, and then the other processes can come into play, like the F2 block will execute and the flow will end, basically. So this is how a outbound policy is applied, and this is how an outbound policy plays, I would say, plays its role.
So we are applying on top of the request connector, right?
Yes, we are applying it on, not just on top of request connector, anything. If you're consuming a WSDL, that time also it will come. It is for all the outbound request going out. Outbound policy for all the outbound requests that you are carrying. This is very rarely used, but at times, if you have certain headers that you need to send again to the the service that you are consuming, and you don't want to set it inside the flow, because this service that you're trying to consume is not just being consumed over here by this application, but other applications in the organization as well. So why do you set the headers in all the applications, right? Instead, you can have it set inside an outbound policy. Outbound policy will inject those headers and then send it to the service provider. And you don't have to again and again set those headers in all the applications, basically. Once you apply this policy, the outbound request that is going to be sent to the service provider is always going to have those headers, because you have applied the outbound policy, and you have set explicitly saying, please add these headers, basically. Please send this set these request headers, basically. Any questions, any doubts here? Yeah. So moving ahead, uh, uh, here you can see a consumer and a provider. So how will this mule message propagation work, right? Once you get a request to the uh, consumer, the consumer has HTTP listener, the F1 block, the HTTP requester, and the F2 block, right? At this point of time, you reach the HTTP request, and HTTP request is trying to send out an outbound request. The outbound policy would come into play. In the outbound policy, you see the tags have been changed. It is HTTP policy operation rather than HTTP policy source. We had HTTP policy source for inbound. Now for outbound, we have HTTP policy operation, and the structure still remains the same. You have the first block over here, then you have the execute next, and first block can be more, okay, more of a code, and then you have the execute next, and the another next block. But what changes over here is whatever is above execute next, right? It gets automatically propagated. Means you don't need to set the flag. It is completely reverse in terms of outbound policy. In outbound policy, you don't need to explicitly need to set a flag when you are basically executing a block above the execute next. But once you're executing a block that is below the execute next, you will have to set the flag to true to basically manipulate any request that is coming in. Basically, it is a very rare case condition, but those options are available. So here, if you take an example, the F1, once you are done with the F1 flow, like the uh, HTTP request, when you want to send the HTTP request out, the policy would come into play. Outbound policy would come into play. The outbound policy would set the header, set the payload, something like policy message, and then go to the provider. At that point of time, the provider would log the payload to be something like policy message, and this, and you don't need to add a flag for it or anything. It is completely opposite.
So,
Once, yeah.
so here the output payload of the Mule application is it will be changed to the policy message.
uh, so this is the provider and the consumer. When you are requesting the consumer, right? We are looking at outbound policy, so you are looking at the consumer, so you will be requesting the consumer from your end, basically, right?
Mhm,
And once the consumer's flow starts executing after the F1, when you have the HTTP request that is going out to the provider, right?
mhm.
This policy would be applied, outbound policy would be applied.
Okay.
So when the provider responds, again the outbound policy would be applied, but the section after the execute next block is applied, and then basically, the response is being taken into consideration here inside the flow, and then the rest of the flow is executed, the F2 block is executed.
Sorry, like so we have like two Mule applications, one consumer and provider. So this
Yes.
outbound policy is applied at the provider level.
The outbound policy is applied on the consumer.
Okay.
The outbound policy is applied on the consumer. When the consumer tries to make a call to the provider, the outbound policy gets triggered.
Okay. So it can,
And
instead of HTTP request, we can have, if for example, it won't work for database connector.
it won't, it would be HTTP request. It won't be for database connector. It won't be for connectors, basically. If you
Okay.
have an HTTP
So HTTP
request that
request
is
will
go-
be it's nothing but another Mule application.
yes, another
So
mule application or any other resource, right?
okay.
WSDL also comes into play. So if you have a soap service as well, this will still come into play.
Mhm.
What all you are trying to send. So um, I don't have an example for it. Uh, Most of the times, this is a very rare case condition. Again, like while outbound, basically while outbound requests are going, we need to set certain headers or do certain validations over the request that is going out to basically check whether there is no sensitive data being sent out or something. That can be done here. This will increase the security on your application. If you are a consumer, suppose,
Okay.
and if you're a banking application as a consumer, right, and you're sending some data out, trying to get some data or sending some data to to a provider, right, the service provider, you will have to apply an outbound policy to check what all data is going, either to monitor it or either to basically validate it, whether if there is a sensitive data, then stop the request, or if some sensitive data is going, mask the request, something like that.
But where we can apply that inbound policy, right, for the consumer to validate all these things that you are saying right now.
So inbound policy won't come into play, right? Inbound policy, what will happen if you apply inbound
Meher,
policy over the
we are
Mhm.
not able to hear you.
Hello?
We are able to see.
Hello?
I'm not
I'm
able to
audible,
Yeah,
hear
right?
you.
yeah, you're audible.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Is Meher audible to you? I'm
Yep,
not.
he is, and you two are audible to us.
Somehow Meher is not audible to me. I guess I'll have to refresh.
So
You're just asking, like you are saying, the we are doing the validation as a consumer end first, and like whether we are. Uh, okay, I got it. Okay.
I have one question on this particular example itself.
Yes.
So if I mean in this flow F1, if we try to set the payload as no policy message, uh, it runs its course. When F2 is, I mean, when we are in F2 flow, the payload is going to be policy message, right?
Yes, the payload is going to be the message that the provider has basically returned. If it is not setting any payload and just returning the payload that this policy is sending it,
Mm-hmm.
then of course it will have a policy message payload before the F2 block gets executed, right?
Yeah. So it
It
gets
will
propagated, right?
it will get propagated.
Okay,
Yes,
that was my question.
considering the provider basically propagates the message only for this example. Now, outbound policies are, an extra top, like level of security that you can add to the request that you are sending out. Most of the times we don't, if you guys know about VPNs basically and VPCs, you only have inbound rules coming in who can access the mule application, and you don't monitor what's going out. But this policy an extra layer of security, in the sense what all things are going out, you can monitor, as well as you can have a validation on top of it, saying, okay, if you're sending this sort of a payload, and this has a sensitive information, do not execute next, something like that, and it will break the request basically. If you have such a condition, it will break the request, and basically it will say, oh, a policy error occurred, and basically, execute whatever error handling you have on HTTP requested will come into play inside consumer, and then send the response to the client that is trying to access this consumer basically.
I have one question.
Yeah, yeah.
Suppose if there is an error inside the HTTP policy proxy, so this block will never executed, okay, and then it will not send to the provider. So how will the provider response to me? I mean the consumer part.
So if you have an error inside, you're
This
trying to say the block after execute next, right?
yes, yes, this
Yes. Yes,
this
if
one.
you have if you have an error inside the block after execute next, and if you're throwing an error, that error will be propagated over here, because you're raising an error and throwing it over here. So the consumer will not get the response from the provider, but it will get the error that you have set it over here. But again, you need to set this flag. You need to have a you need to set a flag to basically propagate, anything that is after execute next in an outbound policy.
Okay, so it will throw to the upper level. I mean, on the
Yes.
customer,
Yes, consumer.
consumer. Sorry.
Yes, consumer. Yes.
Okay.
So this is a normal flow. This is a normal flow without anything after the execute next. So if you have something after the execute next, and you don't have set, that true basically, this set payload won't be utilized by the consumer, because you don't have a flag for this. You will require this flag, propagate message transform true, to basically actually propagate this payload to the consumer, to the consumer application. So it is completely opposite. In inbound policy, we saw anything above execute next is not getting propagated, and you need to add a flag, and everything after execute next, it gets propagated and, sent out. But here it will be exactly opposite of it. Whatever is above the execute next, it's it's by default sent, and it by default propagated. But whatever is after the execute next, for it to propagate, you will have to add this flag. These policies are, you feels like they are same basically, if you are standing from a provider point of view, saying this policy is applied, but the place they are applied are completely different. Provider is not accessible to us. This is another mule application, yes, but this might be some other provider, maybe a third party like Okta, or some third party application. at that point of time, how will you check uh, what all is being sent to that third party provider, right? At that point of time, this outbound policy comes into play. You can log data that is going out, and also modify the data or stop the request from happening if if you feel they're you know how do you say, risky request, something like they have some personal data or PII data that is going out, or a user information that is being exposed due to the request going out. So all these logics, this outbound policy would actually make your application more secure, in a sense. What all is being sent out is also being monitored, something like that, to a third party. And uh, if it is a third party application that you're trying to access from your flow, and it is a very critical business application that if this consumer is a very critical business application, I feel that outbound policy should be applied. And at least you need to monitor, like, uh, the payload that are sent are not violating any sort of or exposing any sort of data that is very, very confidential to you, to the third party service.
So my the payload that we set before the execution next, it will propagate to the flow, and we are just trying to alter the payload here.
Come again, where to be
I'm saying
here here. Mhm.
yes, I'm saying here before execute next, right? So we are we are setting payload. So this particular payload value will propagate to the provider, right?
Provider, yes.
And if we want to alter, then we can put it. Otherwise, the default value will go, right?
Yes, default
Right.
value will go, yes.
And after the next, if you want to respond back as a customized message, we can put
Yes,
flag true and then put it the message.
yes, flag true and put up the message, like modify the payload that is coming in from the provider, and then you know have the mule flow take over, and
Mhm.
consumer flow take over and process it.
If you not put the by default, whatever we'll get from provider, it will be
Yes,
propagate to the consumer.
yes, even if you have a block over here that's setting something.
All right.
Yeah. So Uh, let's see an example for this, right? We spoke about we were talking about outbound policy, but let's see an example about it. I have an outbound policy that I created. I'm going to close this. A simple outbound policy, right? So in this policy, again, I have the hello world, but it is placed inside operation. And here I'm monitoring the outbound policy requests that are going out. And once I have received the request, right? One uh, This log, where is it? Execute next, right? This should not be. This will be executed because I have a flag over here. If I remove this flag, this section won't be executed. Let's see what happens if I have the flag and apply this policy to the application, right? Uh, I'll just disable the inbound policy, and I'll apply the outbound policy.
As in when we deploy our policy to the exchange, automatically this policy will appear here in API manager.
Yes, yes, yes.
Mhm.
So let it take effect. Let's see the runtime manager and also check. So simple, yeah, outbound policy is applied, right? Okay. Now let's watch the logs over here, right? Here from flights, I should now get the flight data because the outbound policy was removed, right? and nothing is acting. There is no block, basically, no policy in front of it to modify the payload that is being sent to me, basically the requester. But when I'm saying outbound policy, what will happen is, as you see, request reach microservice, right? Policy did not come into play. There is no I have if you see, I have logs over here. I have logs over here, and they are all inside the policy operations block. I should have kept one outside, but uh, that would be again adding an inbound policy. So outbound policy does not act. Basically, the very first thing happens is it will go to the microservice. I'm just logging the header and the payload. The headers and payload are logged here. But before the outbound request, this is before the HTTP requester is basically triggered, right? As soon as the HTTP requester is triggered, I go to the outbound policy. Means the message has reached the outbound policy. The request has reached the outbound policy, and then the response the response has been received from the outbound policy, basically. After that, means the the provider has responded, and the outbound policy has caught it, and basically the response has reached the outbound policy over here. Now, as we set in the outbound policy to basically modify again the body and the header, body and the header that has been sent by the provider, right? We have set propagate message transform to true. Hence, the payload that is going to come back to us, right, from the outbound request is now hello world. And after the outbound request, it will just go to the mule application and basically end. Basically, if you see a request, there is another request that we triggered ahead, right? If you see a same request, once you have something like before outbound, once you reach before outbound request, or before before the request is being sent, uh, the HTTP outbound response payload is something like is something like this, and this is within that API. And you see, before the outbound request is sent, and directly inside the API, there is no outbound policy. That's the reason. At that point, we did not have any outbound policies, and this is the payload being provided by the you know provided with the service that we are trying to access. But as we are applying an outbound policy, that payload has been changed to just this hello world, because we have a block after HTTP request, HTTP execute next, basically, to change the response that has come from the provider. This is how outbound policy basically acts. But uh, you can use this again. This section, the section about execute next, can be used for validations or injecting headers, and the response the response also can be validated that has come from the provider. If it is a third party application, uh, maybe it has some data that or maybe it is sending very large data, and our application is going down because of that. Suddenly it is sending some large data, and our application is going down because of that, for a particular request. We might want to discard those requests because such an issue is going on with that service. At that point of time also, this policy can be used, but this is again a rare case conditions. More often it would be used for security reasons, like what all data is being you know send outbound or send to the third party, or do we need to, like, masking the values that are being sent to the third party, and third party then has the key to basically decode those at there and then use it, something like that, to prevent any kind of spoofing or anything that happens while the message transit. But yeah, these are additional level of security that an outbound policy can provide.
Mahir, let's suppose we have a multiple HTTP request. So how this particular outbound policy will behave? It
So
will.
whenever an HTTP request comes into play, right, outbound policy is going to get executed every time. So if you have HTTP request after an HTTP request, the first HTTP request would go this section, right, above the execute next block, then the provider, then then the section that is after the execute next next block, and then again to the next requester basically.
So for example, if you have scatter gather, we are calling multiple system APIs. So it will be applied to each and every HTTP request, right?
Yes, it will be applied on each and every HTTP request. So now system APIs, if you're saying, I won't apply it to system APIs, as it would be an internal application, right? System APIs at the end of the day. If there is any third party service that you're
Any
consuming, then
service calls.
yes, any service calls, then yes.
They are handling the response in that case. They are sending multiple response.
uh, Multiple response in the sense, if you have scatter gather and if you have have HTTP connectors in the scatter gathers, all the HTTP outbound requests are going to use this policy basically, and based on it, you are going to get a response. Means based on it, the result will be reflected inside the consumer.
No, but what will the final response like? Let's suppose we are inserting a header back to the consumer for each HTTP request. So how they can accumulate it? Like how it will
So
behave?
every HTTP response will have an extra attribute,
Mm-hmm.
that would be the header attribute
Mm-hmm.
for it. Means if you're saying scatter gather, means there are multiple HTTP requests going out, right? And
Mm-hmm.
you would have payload 1, payload 2, and payload and payload n basically, right?
Mm-hmm.
For how many scatter gather lanes, parallel threads you want to run. But let's consider there are only two, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there are payload 1 and payload 2, and you are there are two scatter gather lanes where you are requesting one provider, and the other HTTP request you are requesting the same provider or maybe another provider, right? Both those HTTP request or requests going out uh, will have had basically this policy applied on it, and based on the result of the policy, payload one, suppose say if you have a header injection, payload one basically the first response for the first scatter gather thread will also have the header injected, and the second thread will also have the same header injected. These are two individual processes now. These are not blocking process. You have outbound request going out. This policy would be only linked to that outbound request, and not, it won't affect the other outbound request. Every outbound request, the policy will be executed, but it will be its own individual thing basically for that request.
But the response will be one, right? Or it will be different.
It will be different, right? It will be different in this it will be different if you are applying it for HTTP request 1.
Mm-hmm.
The response for that, if the policies suppose say the outbound policy is always setting, like this example, right? Outbound policy is always setting the response payload from the service as hello world, right? Something like that. And you have two HTTP requesters, right? Both the HTTP requesters would at the end, once executed, will have hello world as the payload. Means there will be if they are in sequence, one after the other, the payload would always be hello world. If they are in parallel also, it will be hello world basically.
No, but that will confuse the client, right? The consumer. We have two responses.
We have two responses because you have called the HTTP request twice, right? Hence the two responses. If you have called it once, then it will be only one single response. If you like it has been shown over here, like if you have a single HTTP request, you the policy will only be applied once, and there will be only one single response coming out of
Okay.
coming by the provider, right?
So
If you are
in scatter gather also it will behave the same,
scatter
because we are
gather, or there are multiple requests that, if you're saying scatter gather means there are multiple requests that are going out, and scatter
Mhm.
gather always has an aggregated payload, like payload 1, payload 2, payload 3, something like that.
Right.
And each payload uh, will be result of this policy basically. Then with all the payload 1, payload 2, payload 3, for all the requests would be hello world, hello world, hello world, hello world.
Okay.
Means this policy uh, comes into play every time a request goes out, and it does not depend upon like if there is another request down the line going out basically. The same instance of the means policy will be used again, but from the very beginning again. But the operation is there. Means if you're sending out a request to the policy, it will if you have an outbound request, basically an outbound policy would will see to it that i- if there are any operations performed in it, it will carry out that operations for that particular request. Then if there is a second request coming in, again the policy would start from the beginning and basically see to it that all those at that point of time you will have instances. Now as you're saying, multiple scatter gathers are being used and multiple instances of this also needs to support that. This will also impact your performance in a sense.
See, guys, scatter gather is internal to the application, right? But when you send the response back, it's a combined whatever time we have,
Yes.
many any application number of applications, right?
Right.
So this, when you generate the response and you are sending it back to the client or the caller, right? Then at that level, this policy applies, right? It is not that when you are calling any third-party API, then
Yes.
you are applying this policy. This policy, I call an endpoint. That endpoint does a lot of things. It calls thousands of applications inside it, but at the end, you are going to get only one answer, right?
Yes, that will make sense, right? Yeah.
Yes, and then this policy comes into picture. It's not that everything that goes out of the application that has to be monitored here, and that's not the purpose of this. The purpose of this, the response which you are going to send back to the caller,
Mhm.
that response will go through this policy.
Correct.
Monitor that response.
Even after the flow get executed properly, then it will send the response back, not in between, right?
No, 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 no,
Mhm.
not. It is inbound policies at the starting of the application, and outbound is at the end of the application, when
Mhm.
the instance finishes, right?
All right.
All right.
So let's see an example of both of them together, sort of a thing, an inbound and outbound policy, right? You can have both the policies in a single custom policy. Inbound policy as well as outbound policy can be present in a single custom policy. You just have to have two separate scopes basically. One will be HTTP policy source, and one will be HTTP policy operation. HTTP policy source means it would be inbound policy, and HTTP policy operations means that block will be acting as the outbound policy, right? So if you have such a combined policy, custom policy, the request would basically go first to the inbound policy, then it would carry out the operations that are there inside the flow. As soon as it sees that there is an outbound request going out, outbound policy comes into play. The A3 block will come into play over here. Anything before execute next. Once the once you get the response for the HTTP request, the A4 block gets executed, and then you have the F2 flow or whatever operations need to be carried inside the microservice. And once everything is done, then you again go back to the inbound policy where the very last operation, that is after execute next, is carried out, and then the response is being sent out. This basically goes to show that uh, yeah, you will be observing that the inbound policy is waiting still until all the operations are done, basically, to finish at the end of the day. out Outbound operations, if I take an example, if I take another example over here, saying I have a1 and I have an a1 block, basically have a request coming to the a1 block, and then going to the microservice, and I have http listener 1, http requester 1, sorry, http requester 1 and http requester 2. The http requester 1, once the request starts going out for http requester 1, you will have the a3 block being executed. It will wait for the http requester 1 to basically get its response, so that it can execute the a4 block on it, and then basically then basically set the payload, or whatever variables you have here in a4 block. Now, if you come to the after the HTTP requester 1 is done, then there is a HTTP requester 2. You again see an outbound request going out. Again, the outbound policy comes into play, where the A3 block gets executed. Waits for the after that, it waits for the provider to basically respond. Once the response come, again it will have the A4 block, and then carry out the other operations that are there inside the flow. Once everything is done, you have the A2 block inside the inbound policy that is executed. Any questions regarding this, or is this pairing up with whatever discussion we had earlier for those individual policies, individual type of custom policies? Any questions? Any okay, then moving ahead. There can be, again, now this is getting we are complicating stuff over here, in the sense you have multiple policies, multiple inbound and outbound policies. Basically, custom policies means you have two policies, both of them have an inbound policy in it and an outbound policy in it, as you can observe, and you have a single single microservice that that it's applied on, right? So at this point of time, when the request comes, the request would come be captured by the inbound policy. The a1 block will get executed because this policy a is higher in order. Then it will go to the policy b, as it is lower in order. Basically, order can be defined. It can be policy b can be brought up, and policy a can be brought down. But for now, policy a has order 1, policy b has order 2. The request coming in will flow like a1, b1, and then go to the underlying mule service. If there is any http requester or outbound request, the outbound policy will get executed, but in a reverse order. First thing to get executed would be the a3 block. The a3 block is the first policy, the highest inside the order. Then the b3, then it will wait for the response from the provider, and then it will go from b4 to a4, and then to the mule flow. Once everything is completed inside the mule flow, lowest policy order first, basically, uh, it will go, the outbound policy will be executed, b2 block would be executed, and then the a2 block will be executed. So this is how a multiple inbound and outbound custom policy will take effect if they are applied, basically. So at this point, this condition would look very rare, very rare, to be honest. But these are all the options available to us to basically design and to find the most optimal way you can apply your policy, right? Or design your policy. So any questions on this? Am I audible? Anyone?
Maybe you're audible. That's fine. I guess there are no questions.
Okay. Okay. So this is how an outbound and inbound policy would multiple outbound and inbound policy will interact. But uh, as we said, right, we were discussing about errors and error handling for it. Errors and error handling. We have I have certain scenarios for it. Let's see those scenarios basically. And this is an inbound policy that we will be taking a look at. So if you have an inbound policy applied, right, and you have a P1 block, and then you have a microservice underlying it basically, what will happen is the P1 block gets executed, and suppose say the P1 block itself fails, right? At that very point of time, the policy will have its own error. If you have defined an error handler, the error handler will come into play, the policy error handler will come into play, and the request would be the response would be sent back to the requester or the client that is trying to access the service. If the P1 itself errors out basically, or there is a validation inside P1 that does not match and you want to error out and send it back, something like this error handling would help you basically in that. Now another condition would be where the F1 block inside the service one fails. So you have an inbound policy, you will have the policy block 1, then it would go to the microservice. In the microservice the F1 fails, but what happens when the F1 fails is you have an on error continue block inside it. So F1 error, the flow error handler comes into play, but after that, as it is on error continue, all the other processes are completed, and the inbound policy, the P2 section of the inbound policy is carried out, and then the response is being sent, because you have on error continue. That's the reason you can handle the error over here and just move forward with the request basically. You are not explicitly raising an error. Now let's look at actually raising an error, right? So if you have an if you look at a request coming in to an inbound policy, the P1 block getting executed, and now this request is for service 2, right? And the F1 block fails in service 2, but in service 2 you have an on error propagate rather than an on error continue. On error propagate does is it will propagate the message to the policy. So here the flow error handler also comes into play. It propagates the message to the policy. Again, the policy error handler comes into play saying, oh, something has gone wrong, and then the response is being sent. This is how an error handling happens. We can
So if you do not give error handler in P2, whatever the error we response we get from the service 2 will be propagated directly.
yes, P2 in the sense, no. I did not understand P2.
So I mean, after execute block, if we do not have any error handler, we are providing
After the execute block, if
next.
this one, right?
We have,
Execute next, right? Yeah. If you don't have any error handler block, it will just return this error basically. The flow, whatever error has been raised inside the flow error handler, and if you don't have any error handler over here or P2 over here, basically that will be propagated out to as a response. Yes. That was your question, right?
and here we kept honor continue here. What we keep honor propagate.
Yes, here instead of having on error continue, if you have on error propagate, it will raise an error, and instead of executing the P2, instead of going ahead with the execution of the P2 block, it will not go ahead with the execution but error out and just send the response out. So if you have on error continue, right, P2 block will be executed because it is execute next, it has failed, right? In execute next means the underlying microservice has failed, underlying microservice has raised an error. The error handler basically picks up on the error, works applies its own error handling, that is on error continue, and after the on error continue, if you have a P2 block is applied and then sent back basically as a response. Any questions here? Any other questions? Okay, so moving forward, we saw that we had a YAML file, right? When we create this you create the custom policy using that command, you have a YAML file. What all is there inside that YAML file? The YAML file consists of the ID, the name, the description, category. Why is category and type used? When we are trying to apply a policy, right? Uh, when we are trying to apply a policy, we have filters on top of it. If we apply the right category, the policy will be filtered based on the category, right? Just show policies, apply new policy, and this would be it, category. If you add security, then the custom policy that has security would also come inside this basically. These are this is a completely different filter, but this mule version can be set inside mule artifact JSON. It is similar to a mule application, but as we are talking about the YAML file, these are all the categories that you can use, and once you set this category inside the YAML file, your custom policy would basically start popping up in that category. So I have custom everywhere, right? Custom policy. Hence, when I do category as custom, all the custom policies pop up. That's how this particular part inside YAML is useful. But one second, right? There are other settings as well that can be set inside the YAML file, like encryption supported, or even there is identity management and other things can be. I'll just expand this. Yeah. So as you can see, we have identity management as well, and it can also be set. Also, it will set whether it is standalone or not. And resource level supported is means can it be applied over just a get endpoint for that particular resource, something like that. That is this option basically. If you don't want to enable it, and if you want just all the methods to be used, so just say false, but it won't be recommended to do that. Other than that, you have configurations. Inside the configurations, you have certain fields. These are all custom fields. When you're trying to apply a policy, these fields, if you have custom fields, these fields will pop up, and I can show you that. So if you're trying to apply, let's try to apply a complex custom policy, right? So I have set these fields inside that custom policy: scope and authentication. And I can show you the code for it, where it is. Yeah. So the property name is scope, or the property name is authentication, and both those settings, you can see them over here. One is of type string, This is the type for this, and one is a radio button. Hence, once you take a look at this authentication is a radio button, and you can pick only one value out of it. This is how you apply, right? And this is how you set basically the interface as well. But now you will be, if you are curious to know, now you will be wondering, how will I get the values that are being set, right? When I'm trying to apply this policy, I will set some values inside the field. How can I use those values inside the policy? For that thing, you will have to use something known as handlebars. Basically, handlebars is nothing but a way to use a way to a way to use value of that particular property inside your policy code. So if you go inside, if I can show 1 second, right? In this custom policy code, I have it set. Or even by default, when you have a default policy coming up, right? Is the default policy gone? Yeah, policy demo, right? This is the very basic one that we created. As you open this template.xml for even for the basic one, right, you will see the handles being used, basically handlebars being used, and this is generated by the command itself. This handlebar, this property is uh, I don't know if you guys are aware, but if you have some runtime properties that are always present, like full domain or uh, uh, domain path or something where the application is deployed. It is something like that. These are default. These are default, and you have couple of them. Those are default. One is the policy ID, and the other one, I'm not sure, but I need to check. The other one, I added this. The other one would be yes, Wisdal endpoint, yes or no, basically, based on it. And for identity management also, there are certain default handlebars policy that you can handlebar variables that you can use inside your application. So if I use this policy, if I use this policy, this policy, where is it gone? This policy, and here I'm setting, as you can see, I'm setting these two variables. Scope and authentication is being set in this variable, and then I'm injecting them into the payload. The request payload, the request payload to the microservice, right? We can see these being injected over here inside the payload. This is how you can access. This is how you can access the values from the configuration of the policy while applying the policy. And you can have logic running over this, like various amounts of business logic running over this, basically. What all inputs, based on the inputs added, you can carry out certain operations. So this is handlebars. These brackets are called handlebars, and these are basically used to get the values of the variables that you set when you're trying to when you apply the policy, basically. Other than that, uh, custom policy also has a class loading mechanism. You would be knowing about class loading mechanism. There is class loading isolation inside Mulesoft application, as in the sense, a dependency used by application A, application B does not have access to it. It is completely blocked, and there is no way for application B to basically use that dependency. But uh, policy, it is a bit different. You have these class loading isolations between policies, but not between policy and the application it is applied on. Policy and the application it is applied on has a open gate sort of a thing. Means the resources that are set, or the variables the resources that are or dependencies that are used by the application can be accessed by the policies as well. And if you're trying to say about dependencies, if a policy has a dependency of a lower version, that is 1.0, and if the application is using the dependency of a higher version like 0.2, the 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 policy will end up using the higher version 0.2 basically, and not the 1.01 that you have specified for it.
Impact to the policies code.
Come again,
I'm
sorry.
saying if it will use the higher version, and will it impact the policy code, or because there is
Depends.
no.
Depends upon what it is importing, right? Depends upon what it is importing. Yes, it will have impacts if it is incompatible, but if it is compatible, it will use, and it will you won't even notice it.
Mhm. So there is no class loading isolations for policy and application, right?
Yes,
Yes.
policy and the application it is attached to. It is
Mhm.
not completely isolated, basically. So, um, as you 1 second, right? I'll just highlight this point before moving ahead. As you see in the very last statement, this statement over, however, any plugin, library, or resource visible to policy is not visible to the application applied. Any plugin, library, resource visible to the application is also visible to the policy. It's it's one way basically. Policy can have a look, but the application can't. So yeah, that's it for, I guess, custom policies. We can also have caching in them. You can apply object store and have caching in policies. You can I mean, there are endless possibilities, but yeah.
Thanks, Meher. Thank you so much
Yeah.
for this detailed session. Guys, if you have any questions, you can feel free to ask right now.
Mamu,
And if you don't have any questions right now, and you go back and check on the stuff what we learned again today, you can feel free to reach out to Meher, to me, over LinkedIn. Maybe we'll be able to help you out of any of the scenarios you have issue with. Right?
Thank you, Meher, for our very detailed session. So it's a really good session, right?
Yeah,
It was
Ravi.
very difficult to cover. He tried to cover so many scenarios. Yeah. Thanks for his patience, and he prepared a lot actually.
Yeah, he did. He did. He's one of the best we got, Ravi.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being a very nice audience, to be honest. I like to have an interaction going and not not just speaking.
Yeah, it's also you are also very responsive, and you try to answer for most of the questions.
Thank you.
Right.
With your level of experience, but still you try to justify. It's I really appreciate.
Well done, Mayor. Well, well
Thanks,
done.
Rahul. Yeah.
Thanks, Ravi.
Thank
All
you.
right, guys. I would like to capture a photo first, and then we'll talk about a few things, and then we'll sign off. Yes, if you guys can turn on your cameras. Tushar is definitely in Shimla. All right. Where are the rest? Guys, come on. Just a pic. All right. On the count of three. 1, 2, 3. Thank you. All right. So I have few questions as part of our today's trivia quiz. You can answer them on the chat. The first one, the first answer on the chat will be the winner for that. And all right. My first question is: how many categories of policies we have? I guess Gaja is the right answer. That's five. Thank you. Gaja, if you can send your email address on the chat, please. All right. My second question is: if I have a code, right, and deploy that policy, can I deploy policy without changing anything? Harsh has the right answer. We can't do that. We will, because the basic of this is that it goes to which Mihir said somewhere in the call, right? That so every time it has to be a new asset ID or the artifact ID. You have to change that, and then only you can do that.
So we miss. I misinterpret the question. Sorry.
And that's okay. No worries. So, okay, just a sec, guys. First, you can ping me your address later. And yeah, what is the number of policies we can apply on a single instance of API manager? I guess everybody knows that answer. That we don't have a predefined number of that. All right. I guess we have, as per my chat, because it's two people are on the tie, Tushar and Aditi. All right, Aditi and Tushar, if you can send your email addresses to me, ping those on chat, please. Or you can feel free to drop me those messages on the WhatsApp group or chat. All right, that's all. I guess with that, I would like to conclude the session today. Mehit, thank you so much for this detailed session. It was really awesome. And yeah,
Shiva, thank you so much for all the information you shared, and Meher, a very good session, I must say. I really appreciate the explanation you guys have about the custom policy. This is the first time I see a lot of things about the custom policy. Earlier, we used to have a very some sort of simple information, but now we have in-depth details. So I really appreciate of it. And I just giving a suggestion like. If it is possible for this kind of audience, can we have a session for OpenID Connect where we can apply for the user authentication as well as the API, how we can secure it?
can do. Definitely, we can do that. We'll be in touch over LinkedIn, WhatsApp group, or we can always have that next meetup. And we are planning on other meetups soon. And there are a few things which we are trying to. I and Jackie and in Bapna, we are trying to do something around custom policies. When we are done with that, we'll definitely share those things too. But yeah, OpenID Connect, definitely will. I'll try to make that as a next meetup presentation for. Maybe I'm not sure who will present, but I'll try to present it myself. If not, then maybe someone will prepare that and we'll do that session.
Yeah, please include our APIs or our application how we can secure using the OpenID Connect, because we know how we can use OpenID Connect to authorize the user, but there is no detail or information how we can secure our APIs and how we can
Definitely,
provide that.
definitely. We'll take your suggestion, and thank you so much for being that. You know, where a lot of questions were asked, and I guess that clarifies a lot of things to a lot of people. Thank you so much for being that audience today. All right. If you guys have anything else, do feel free to reach out over LinkedIn, and there is also a group for the NCR region we have. You can always try connect over that. Right.
Much everybody. Have a nice day
Thank
ahead.
you.
Thank you.
Have a
Thank
nice
you.
day. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.